Did you miss me? Back again. By the way, I just hit my head. There's a light fixture right there. This is the hobbit room. So called because it's so small that you can't be any taller than a hobbit and stand up in here. It's the room over the garage. Here, let me show everyone what this room looks like. Let's see here. Get my wires tangled up here. Okay, so over here are that's my armor. There's a German Panzer IV with a high explosive, and there's a Panther. Then I like playing games, as Dr. Quinn does as well. So there's Eclipse, great science fiction game. Cthulhu. There's one on the battle in North Africa with Rommel. That was, let's see, a bunch of war games over here. Hitler's Reich. Sands of War. That's an interesting game. It covers every desert war from World War II through the Arab-Israeli, no, through Iraq, actually. So let's see, I got more crap back here. Back up here. There's my window air conditioning unit, which I can't use right now because I discovered the other day that it's too loud when I make a video, and I had to go back through and figure out how in the hell I take sound out of a video. But I learned. Using, what's that free program? Audacity. So anyway, there's Alex's bedroom, but Alex is away at law school, so we're just using that for storage right now. And back to our program. All right, let me zoom in here again. Too much. There, all right. Okay. Uh-oh. While I was moving it, I got my microphone cord all tangled up. There it is. That makes a huge difference, by the way. I don't like depending on the microphone that's built into the camera. All right, next thing. I'm going to have 3 quick definitions. See, here's the thing with this class. You're not required to have already taken any specific economics course. It's just 3 hours is the only prerequisite for this course, any 3 hours of economics. And it could be micro or macro. Generally speaking, it's going to be the intro classes. Micro or macro. So I cannot assume that everyone's had macro. I cannot assume that everyone's had micro. I have to assume that you haven't had, you've had a class, but it might not be the one I want to talk about right now. So for the point being, economics, micro, economics, and macro economics. I just want to give you some definitions real quick in case you haven't had this before. And it also raises some interesting issues as well. Hang on, let me look at the quizzes here. Yeah, no problem. All right. And it also raises some interesting issues with respect to what we're talking about in this class. All right, first of all, what's economics? Man, I wish this was live. Well, it is for me. Because you asked this in class, like, well, what's the most common definition you hear of what economics is? And the science of scarcity. Let me write this up here. The science of scarcity. That is one school of thought's definition of economics. It is not the definition of economics. Well, actually, I think a couple of them would accept that. I don't mean to say that 1 out of the 8, but it's absolutely not the definition of economics. This is about allocating scarce resources among infinite wants, all right? Well, let's look at the most devastating economic event in U.S. history, the Great Depression. That was not about scarcity. We didn't have limited resources relative to demands. We had too much of a resource. We had way too much of a resource. We had way too much labor. Or if you're watching this in England, labor. We didn't have scarce resources. We had more labor than we could use. All right? Unemployment is the opposite of a scarce resource. So, well, jobs are scarce. Yeah, but that's the employment of a resource. All right? So scarcity is about having insufficient resources to meet everyone's demands, and yet our biggest economic problems are often associated with the excess of a resource. So this science of scarcity thing is really limited to a couple of schools of thought, but they're the dominant schools of thought, well, the dominant school of thought, and so that tends to be the definition given. And so what have we got instead? All right, so I wrote something up here to find something sort of very general. I'll show you all these in just a minute. I'll just tell you right now. Economics is the social science that studies production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Very, very general. And notice it doesn't have to be capitalism that we're talking about here. This could be an ancient tribal community. A tribal community must produce goods and services, kill elk or whatever, right? They've got to distribute. They've got to decide who gets the first. And this is actually a big deal in anthropology. When you like, who gets the first cut of the elk that was killed, all right? Who gets the last cut? Who has to prepare the food? There were very, very varying from tribe to tribe, but there were, very strict rules about these things. And then, the consumption of goods and services. So this doesn't have to be about a market system, right? Whereas generally, when we do economics, we're just doing market systems, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, the vast majority of Homo sapien history was not capitalism. So if we want to limit ourselves to, 500 years at most, and let's ask the internet here real quick. When did Homo sapiens sapien evolve? 1.8 million years ago. That's the beginning, though, of Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sapien. But I'm thinking 100,000? One of my daughters majored in anthropology. I could ask her, but she's not here. So let's say it's 100,000 years. All right. Then calculator, all right, clear. And then 500 years at the outside to define the market. The capitalism had been around probably closer to 150, 200. Divided by, we're talking about 0.1% of Homo sapien history if we want to limit ourselves to capitalism. So, again, one of the things that different schools of thought are going to focus on. Institutionalism, for example, is going to be very self-conscious about, we're just studying economics. We're not studying capitalism. We're studying economics. Is capitalism a big part of that? Yeah, and most of their research is about capitalism. But that's not where they limit themselves to. All right, so second thing. Did you know that not all schools of thought really even bother to split between a micro and a macro? That from the Marxist perspective, for example, there's really not much point in doing that. As you'll see later, there's really not much point in having a separate micro and macro in Marxism. And in Austrianism, in some respects, all they do is micro, because they believe that the micro part explains the macro part, which is also similar to what the neoclassicals do as well. So, but let me tell you what they are. Okay, micro, and I probably just stole this off the internet somewhere. Microeconomics is a branch of economics that studies how individuals, households, and firms make decisions regarding the acquisition and distribution of resources and output. So it's about individual firms, individual households, and individuals, how they make decisions, right? That's micro. Macro is the study of economics in terms of whole systems, especially with reference to general levels of output and income, and to interrelations among different sectors in the economy. For example, how does the financial sector affect housing? How does the financial sector affect firms' physical investment, and so on? Let me show you these real quick. Look over here on my... Okay, yeah. You might want to pause your video there and jot those down. I don't want to send them around. It creates laziness. And I mean, not that I wouldn't do the exact same thing, but then that's why I don't want to incentivize you to not write these things down and make sure that you get these, because writing it, just the very act of writing it, helps you remember what these things are about. But anyway, so just pause the video, write those. Now I'll get to that number 5 here in just a minute. Okay. All right. Now one more kind of introductory concept. A definition. I wonder how far we're going to make it into fall semester. If baseball teams that have a huge economic incentive to not get coronavirus can't keep from getting coronavirus, let's see how long we last. But anyway, we'll hope for the best. I got a bunch of great new masks, so that's good. I'll have that ready. All right, we're doing 8 different schools of thought, right? Well, what the hell is a school of thought? A school of thought or paradigm. Sometimes if I get in the screen there, it tries to focus on me. Okay, completely out. There we go. I got a whole bunch of brand new pens from the department, and they're already not working very well. Anyway, hey, that's my problem. I started to say it's my problem, not yours, but it ends up kind of being your problem too. All right. What is a school of thought? Well, here's how I'm going to define it, because everybody's going to define it differently. Man, oh man. When you look at the book, that second chapter called economic science or something like that, that it took forever to write, because there are a lot of controversial issues in there in terms of, and not even controversial, it's just things that are hard to tie down. For example, what is a school of thought? What are we going to consider a school of thought? Bob over there believes so-and-so. Is Bob a school of thought? So we have to have a definition here that gives us some sense of what we're talking about when we're saying there's a school of thought called institutionalism. There's a school of thought called ecological economics. What does that mean? What is it that distinguishes them and makes them a school of thought? I'm glad I asked that question. Let me show you. Wishing I brought up a glass of water with me right now, but it didn't happen. But you know what? For you, I'm going to struggle through this. What's a paradigm? It is a set of assumptions. I'm going to write a couple of these things down. I'll show you. You saw it a minute ago, but I'll show you again in a second here. But let me just jot down some of these things. A set of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices, all right, that constitute a way of viewing reality. I'm thinking that other purple pen was a good one. It was. For the community that shares them, let's do that in green. Okay, so let me read the definition. What is a school of thought? All right, what distinguishes, what makes it a school of thought and not just Bob sitting over there in the corner pouting because nobody else believes what he believes? It is a set of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices that constitutes a way of viewing reality for the community that shares them, especially an academic, or it has intellectual community, which I guess is a better word, especially an intellectual community. Because it doesn't have to be academic, per se. Intellectual. Let me show you this real quick so you can write it down, but then I'd like to talk about it for a minute because there's some really interesting stuff there. All right. There it is. A set of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices that constitutes a way of viewing reality for the community that shares them, especially in an intellectual discipline. All right? So hopefully you paused and have now restarted. All right, first of all, something that's kind of interesting about this, when I was at your stage, I would have thought to myself, a way of viewing reality, that seems kind of wishy-washy, if you will. That's a technical term. That I thought that a school of thought was something, hard, that, it's these theories here, it's these equations and so forth. No. I'm sorry, I should back up and say there's a bit of a difference between paradigm and school of thought. In this class there's not going to be, but because to be honest, in the book I didn't want to say paradigm over, as I wanted to switch out now and then and say school of thought. So I say early on in the book, I'm going to treat these as synonymous. But really and truly, a paradigm is a bit broader in some sense than a school of thought. It doesn't have to be, but generally speaking, when you say that, people are thinking of something broader than a school of thought, because a paradigm, and that's what we're talking about in this class, is 8 different paradigms, 8 different views of the way reality works, because that's what these really are. These are ways of thinking about how does economic behavior, and what's economic behavior? production, distribution, and consumption. All right, that's what it's all about. Production, distribution, and consumption. How does that work in the real world among Homo sapiens? We're basically studying Homo sapien behavior, right? And so these different schools of thought are all different ways of viewing that reality, of interpreting that reality. Now, each one of those views includes a set of assumptions. For example, let's see here. The neoclassical school of thought believes that everyone acts rationally, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the neoclassical school of thought varies more within its borders than probably any other school of thought because it's so big. You're likely to get more variation. The Austrians believe that that macroeconomics is a bad, or I'm sorry, that the macro level doesn't really reveal much because you can't really. Oh, I'll give you a good one on the Austrian one. That they're suspicious of aggregative economic statistics like GDP. Like GDP, what the hell does GDP measure? I mean, you can't really measure the output of a nation because each good is different, each person, how they use it is different. They'll use GDP for, some studies, but really and truly, you can't really add up GDP any more than you can add up love. We know love exists, but we can't add it up. All right, so we can't add up the productive capacity of a nation. So that's one of their assumptions. Right. So various concepts. Okay. So with Marx, class is a really important concept. That there are workers and capitalists. All right, very important concept. Let me skip values for a second, but, well, no, let's not. That's another one that if I were you, I'd have been like, values? Yeah, ain't nobody doing this. Everyone is coming from a perspective. Everyone is coming from an angle of what they think is good and right and just. And there's a section in every chapter on what is their sense of justice. What is it they're out to do? Some people don't spend their lives studying this just because, it's fascinating. Okay, maybe there's one person. Maybe it's that Bob guy that's pouting over in the corner. But generally speaking, especially the really active people in these schools of thought, Marx was not just, hey, isn't this fascinating? He also thought, hey, isn't this awful? And we need to make a change. And these are my values. And this is the way I think the world ought to work. All right, this is what I think fair is. So each school of thought has a sense of justice, a sense of fairness. Because that's the driving force behind why you want to study this stuff in the first place, is this sense of, I want to make the world a better place. I was at a conference one time, a day early, well, like anyone would be, and I was down at the bar, right? So the conference hadn't actually started yet. I was down at the bar, and it was at the Naval War College. It was a conference on economics and cybersecurity. And the woman that had put the conference together ended up at the bar as well. So we ended up talking to each other. And I can't remember what the subject matter was, but at some point she says, well, we want to save the world. And I was like, well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's why we do this. We want to make the world a better place. So values absolutely are a big part of every paradigm. And again, we'll cover that. And then practices. Practices mean things like, neoclassicals like to use mathematical modeling. Something that they use sometimes in institutionalism is system dynamics modeling, which is a computer simulation, and so on. So the various tools of analysis that we might use. So we've got certain assumptions, things that we take for granted, oftentimes things we couldn't test even if we wanted to, that it's impossible to test these things. Then we have sort of definitions that we're creating about the world. There's class. I'm going to call this system capitalism. In institutionalism, I'm going to talk about ceremonial and I pointed the wrong thing. Ceremonial and instrumental valuing, which actually goes under concepts. And then everyone's going to have their feeling about what they think needs to be done to make the world a better place. And then we're going to have the actual tools, the actual carrying out of our analyses down here based on, these are assumptions we're making, these are the various factors that we think are important, like class, like institutions and new institutionalism versus organizations and so on. And then here we are actually doing the research. And all of this constitutes really just a way of viewing reality for this community. Now, a paradigm doesn't have to be something that's intellectual, but it will be in this classroom. Yeah, so that's a lot on a very short question, but there you have it. I'm going to do one more here. Yeah, I'm going to do one more here. Then I want to get that water. And this is the first thing we're going to do here that isn't just kind of definitional, that is saying something substantive about schools of thought. And it's Thomas K-U-H? Yeah. Kuhn's normal versus revolutionary science. So there's this guy, Thomas Kuhn. That's hard to read, and I'll get out of the way. You don't need to write it down anyway. I'm going to show you something with it on there in a minute on the typed paper. But Thomas Kuhn, I think it's 1970, wrote this book called Structure of Scientific Revolution that sparked all kinds of critiques and people saying, yeah, you're right, and so forth. When I took History of Economic Thought, I think, in like 1981, something like that, that was one of the things I had to read. I have a copy of it around here somewhere. I'm not sure if I read it or not, but I got an A in the class, so hey. But I don't know if I read the whole thing. So, but what he has to say there, I'm going to tell you, it probably doesn't really fit economics, but some of the concepts do. All right, some of the concepts really do quite well, and these will be things that we can fall back on as the semester goes on, thinking about his distinction between normal versus revolutionary science. And I'll show you this in a minute, so you can jot it down. But I just want to talk about it right now. Most of what scientists do, whether we be social scientists or natural scientists or whatever, or people in the business school, finance professors, people in the dance department who are researching various concepts. Most of what they do is normal science, right? Normal science is the routine thing that you do where you're experimenting within a paradigm, slowly kind of accumulating detail about your school of thought. For example, when Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, which was revolutionary at the time, after that, lots of people did things within the context of the theory of relativity. They weren't changing the theory of relativity. They were accepting that, but they were re-examining concepts they'd examined before, and they were examining new concepts from the perspective of the theory of relativity. All right? So they weren't doing anything revolutionary like Einstein had done, but they're doing something important, and they just kind of slowly like, hey, wait a minute. If Einstein's right about that, then is it also, what kind of impact does that have on I'm going to make something up here, on the Doppler effect? Does it have an impact on that? Let's do a study on that and find out. It doesn't, or it does, And so you're going through examining other phenomena from the perspective of your accepted paradigm. The vast majority of what people do is just normal science. Another thing they call it is puzzle solving. We've got puzzles left that we're trying to figure out what's going on. Now, here's a really important part. It tends to generate conservatism. Not political conservatism, but conservatism in terms of that school of thought. The more research you do as a Marxist, pushing back these little, sort of puzzles, the more you subconsciously begin to view the world that way automatically. I mean, when it's new to you, you don't. When it's new to you, you're still struggling with it and deciding whether you think it makes sense. But after you've done it, I've been doing this for 34 years. And so as a consequence, in my schools of thought, I've done, research paper after research paper in that school of thought. That's the way I think about the world now, not even necessarily consciously. That it seeps into your subconscious that this is simply the way the world works. So you become very resistant to change in terms of the overall paradigm. All right. So this process creates conservatism in terms of the acceptance of the overall theory, of the broader theory. However, more great stuff. Anomalies may accumulate. There are always things that don't look right. Wait a minute. If this theory says so-and-so, I can't make sense of this phenomenon. All right? That there's an anomaly that I can't explain with the overall theory. Now, they'll accumulate over time. inevitably. But very often, let's see, I'll write this in red, very often they're written off as either, minor outliers or errors in observation. All right? So a lot of times in a school of thought, even when the anomalies accumulate, and that makes sense. You know, you first see this, you say, oh, what's wrong with these lazy sons of guns? They're just writing it all off. Well, they could be right. I mean, what if Coach Patterson has been telling his football team not to commit turnovers, not to fumble the ball away, not to throw interceptions, because those lead you to losing a game, and then TCU wins despite the fact that they had more turnovers than the other team? Oh, I guess I was wrong. No, it was a minor outlier, all right? So studying more tends to raise your grade than studying less, all right? Well, in this case, it didn't because I studied the wrong thing or whatever, I don't know. But, you know, it's perfectly legitimate you've studied, your school of thought has studied a million phenomena. We found one where it doesn't work. Okay, you know what? I'm not ready to throw out the entire theory. That it's either a minor outlier or we might have even measured it wrong, which is a big problem in economics because we're dependent on other groups to measure these economic phenomena for us. Like we don't, if we were an agricultural campus and we were trying to figure out the effectiveness of this one, fertilizer, then we would plant various fields, try different fertilizers, control all the elements, and we would create our own data. We would then use those data to determine whether or not this fertilizer was more or less efficient or whatever. We got to get government statistics. We rarely get to create our own data. So this does happen. For a period in the 80s, I think, the U.S. was reporting its imports incorrectly from Canada. They were reporting it incorrectly to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Canada had different numbers for their exports to the U.S. than the U.S. had for their imports from Canada. And so somebody had to be wrong, and the U.S. was doing it wrong. Some poor devil, some poor professor, I'm sure, wrote a paper based on data that were mismeasured. So it happens, right? But, all right, if these accumulate sufficiently, if you get, because this creates pressure to reject the paradigm, right? If it's so huge, the anomalies, that it overwhelms these two down here, then you get a revolution. Then you get revolutionary science, which Kuhn defines as the exploration of alternative theories that reject long-held axioms. An axiom is an assumption that is central to your school of thought, all right? Things that, you know, let's see here, that matter exists. I don't know, I was a physics major for a whole quarter. That rejects these long-held axioms. Now, even during the revolution, did you know that Einstein's theory of relativity was he had to fight for it, just like his right to party? He had to fight for it because other people didn't believe him. And so because this process here builds up so much conservatism, so much resistance to change, he had to fight for something that is now taken for granted in physics. So it will still be a fight, but if and when it does win, then you get a paradigm shift, right? The school of thought goes to a new, or the discipline rather, shifts to a new school of thought, a new paradigm. In that event, if you do get a paradigm shift, then the new theory will be very incomplete, with many puzzles remaining to be solved, which ushers in a new period of normal science. So you get long periods of this, short period of that, long period of this, short period of that, long period of this, short period of that, is the idea with Kuhn. Let me show you this real quick. You can pause the video and have a look. I don't want you to see this other part, so I'm going to fold it over. Okay. So if you want to pause the video and jot down here what you've got for Kuhn's difference between the normal and revolutionary science. Normal science is the relatively routine work of scientists experimenting within a paradigm, slowly accumulating detail in accord with established theory. Oh, let me back up a little bit. It tends to generate conservatism in terms of the acceptance of that broad theory. Anomalies may accumulate, however. So long as they are not dismissed as errors in observation or minor outliers, these create the pressures that lead to revolutionary science, the exploration of alternative theories that reject long-held axioms. This will be strongly resisted, but may in the end lead to a paradigm shift. In that event, the new theory will be very incomplete, with many puzzles remaining to be solved. This ushers in a new period of normal science. All right, but that ain't what happens in economics. And in fact, as I said, there was a lot of controversy. I think the idea of normal science creating tremendous conservatism makes a lot of sense, all right? What we don't get in economics, when these outliers, what color have I not used here? Black. When these outliers, when these anomalies accumulate, we don't get a paradigm shift, we just get a new paradigm. In other words, we don't end up with we all go along believing this one theory, and then we have a revolution, and then we have a new theory, or a new school of thought. I should be more careful about that. Revolution, new paradigm, revolution, new paradigm. That's not what happens in economics. All right. What happens is, now we get a new school of thought. In fact, actually, let me erase this. Everyone believes this. There's a revolution which creates a new school of thought, but everyone just keeps on believing what they were believing before, all right? And so then you can have a little revolution down here with a new school of thought, except this one goes on before. We tend not to replace old schools of thought, all right? We tend not to have Newtonian physics replaced by Einstein's theory of general relativity. We tend to just break off on another branch, all right? And why? Well, part of the problem is that the cogency stuff is so subjective, right? And we're not neutral politically, our discipline. There's not really a breakdown between, say, hey, back when Einstein was arguing for the theory of relativity, mostly it was Democrats that were in charge of the theory of relativity, and mostly it was Republicans that were in favor of the Newtonian physics. That's not true, but it is for us. All right, more so, not completely. You don't get a lot of Republican Marxists. All right, and so if you're someone who's drawn to the view that the owners of capital are properly rewarded in our society, that it's fair, that they are as wealthy as they are, and that perhaps workers are kind of lazy, you're not going to end up being a Marxist. So it doesn't really matter the amount of evidence. It is really hard in economics to break somebody away from their school of thought. And again, part of that is because, and of course that goes back to those assumptions and that what else did I have on the list there, John? Values, all right? That these are not separate from things that we would think of as very sort of deep-seated in Homo sapiens. But that doesn't mean that you can't be an economist who I always tried to, the very first economics book I ever read that I didn't have to read, Alfred Eichner's Megacorp and Oligopoly, because I was ended grad school and I actually wanted to read it just for fun, which is sickening, but I did. And when I got done with the book, I'm reading through the book, right? And I'm about 9/10 of the way through the book, and he's talking about the way firms operate and how they generate investment funds and so forth. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. And by the way, I lean heavily towards that observation end of that. Where do you get your premises? So he's citing all kinds of studies of actual firms. And I love the book. Got to the last chapter, and he talks about his policy recommendations. I was like, I don't like that. I don't want that to be the policy. I want there to be something simpler, something that just sort of automatically fixes things. And I came to an important conclusion for myself, and that was, if you are reading through the premises and they all make a lot of sense to you, you need to be careful of then deciding to reject the conclusion just because you don't like it. All right? And it took me a while to get over that and think to myself, well, actually, if he was right about this, and if I believed he was right about that, those things naturally led to this. I just didn't want to think it. All right? And so the point I'm trying to illustrate here is, I think the healthiest thing to do is to focus your attention up here and let that fall where it may. Because that's where the politics are, all right? That's where, should we intervene in the economy or not? Don't let that be your starting point. Let that be one of your conclusions. Whether or not we should destroy capitalism, all right? Don't let that be your starting point. Let that be your conclusion. Start off as much as you can, simply trying to come up with, again, complete objectivity is impossible, but reasonable premises and theories about the way the world works, and then just see where that leads you. But don't be like falling in love with a conclusion before you've even started. It'd be like if you were a carpenter and you already know, I want to use the saw. So I'm going to define my problem in a way that leads me to the conclusion that I have to use a saw. No, go through and figure out, say, oh, no, actually I need a screwdriver, all right? And then don't say, but I don't want to use the screwdriver, I want to use the saw. Well, you can't do that, all right? This, to me, is the focal point. The assumptions, the concepts, and let those lead you to the conclusions. All right, that's just me. Let's see. So next video is going to be about the economics discipline, but right now I'm going to go get a drink of water. Au revoir, mes amis. That's French.